Now to a horrific story out of Myanmar. The Associated Press confirming the discovery of more than 5 mass graves. We warn you that some of the pictures are graphic. The video evidence collected by the AP shows that a massacre took place in August at the Rohingya village of Gurdarpian in northern Rakhine state. That is the same state where military abuses were widely blamed for driving more than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims to flee into Bangladesh. The government denies any massacre took place. Bodies of the victims were found days after residents say soldiers stormed the village. The faces of men half buried in the mass graves had been burned away by acid or by bullets. Survivors interviewed by the AP said the soldiers carefully planned the attack and then tried to hide what they had done. Also in Myanmar today, 2 Reuters journalists detained on charges of violating secrecy laws were back in court today for a bail hearing. The pair were arrested in December after meeting with police officials in Yangon, the country's commercial capital. They had been reporting on the situation in Rakhine State. Joel Simon is executive director of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Joel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's begin with the situation in Myanmar. These 2 journalists are in jail for reporting on this situation in Rakhine State where this alleged atrocity took place. How difficult is it for reporters to do their job in Myanmar?
It's incredibly difficult. Obviously, this is a huge international story with tremendous implications. You've got allegations of a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, forcing hundreds of thousands of Rohingya into exile in Bangladesh. So this is an enormous global story, and the government of Myanmar is extremely sensitive, and it's taken a number of measures to restrict coverage, including denying access and now this repressive action against these 2 Reuters journalists.
Is it possible to know why the government has targeted these 2 Reuters reporters in particular?
I think there's just sensitivity to the story and an effort to ensure that critical coverage send a message about their sensitivity. So I think it was we don't really know. We don't really know precisely what the government was thinking. These journalists seem to have been set up. They went to a meeting with military officials at a restaurant. They were given documents. Immediately after being given those documents, they were arrested. So the best guess is that they wanted to set some sort of example and make clear that they would not tolerate this kind of reporting.
Now, they've been held in prison. There was a bail hearing today.
Yes.
Bail was again denied.
Right.
What is the Committee to Protect Journalists asking the government of Myanmar to do?
This is very simple. We're asking that they be released. At the minimum, they should be released on bail so that they can mount an adequate legal defense. These charges, we believe, are without foundation. They're punitive. They're baseless. We think they should be dropped altogether. But at a minimum, they should be released on bail. And I should say that obviously this is the message that we're conveying. But there's a global message. There's a huge international outcry and response. The General Secretary of the United Nations today spoke out. He has done so previously, and he spoke out again today. The U.S. government, European governments around the world, journalists around the world. There's really and this is something that's very positive. There's been a very strong international response.
Is there evidence that beyond the arrests and detention of these 2 Reuters journalists, that the government is carrying out a campaign against other journalists, including Rohingya journalists who are trying to document what's happening?
Well, I was in Myanmar over the summer and had an opportunity to meet with journalists there in Yangon and also with government officials. There's no question. When Myanmar made a transition to democracy, one of the hallmarks of that transition was the opening space for the media. It was for a long time one of the most repressive and closed countries in the world. And journalists were released from prison, many who had been held there for extended periods. There was an opening in the media. Exile media returned and began working. And that space is closing. There are restrictive laws. These are not the first journalists to be imprisoned. There have been others. Access to Rakhine State is extremely limited. It's basically impossible at this point to get access. So that's why so much of the reporting involves speaking with exiles and refugees who are now in Bangladesh.
Turning now to another story which is capturing attention, and that is in Kenya,
Yes.
in Africa. So we've seen this series of events take place where there is an election is overturned,
Right.
a second election is held, there is a mock inauguration on the part of the loser, if you will, didn't participate in the second round of elections, which is deemed a treasonous act by the government of Kenya,
Right.
and they then try to suppress both reporting of this and broadcasting of this.
Yes.
What's the situation in Nairobi now?
Well, the situation in Nairobi is, as you mentioned, the opposition candidate, Raul Odinga, held what he, as an act of protest, a mock inauguration. Prior to this inauguration, the government called in members of the media and said, you may not cover this. This is prohibited. A number of broadcasters said, we have an obligation to cover this. This is a legitimate news event. So 3 of these private broadcasters were shut down. They were taken off the air. They were accused of incitement to violence. The government has made very strong statements. There's been a Supreme Court ruling that this ban be lifted. They be allowed to resume broadcasting. But as far as we know, they remain off the air.
So in defiance of a ruling from the Supreme Court, these broadcast outlets remain shuttered.
No. What happened was the president and the administration warned them not to cover this mock inauguration, and they defied that request and covered it anyway. And then after the government sort of pulled the plug on these broadcasters, the Supreme Court ruled that ban was not legal, but the government has not yet complied and lifted the ban and allowed them back on the air.
What kinds of fears does this raise for press freedom in Kenya?
Well, it's potentially a constitutional crisis. I mean, you have to keep in mind that Kenya has a history of a vibrant, vigorous, independent media. It's really a beacon for East Africa, for all of Africa, and for the world, really. And so this is a huge setback. It really calls into question the commitment of the government to freedom of the press. Freedom of the press is not easy. It's precisely in these moments of crisis when it is challenged, and when the people of Kenya need access to this kind of information, when these kinds of political challenges are being played out. And so the government is not meeting its commitment to its own constitution, to its own history, and to its international obligations. So it's a very difficult and troubling moment.
You know, over the course of the last year, we've heard much from President Trump, much that has attacked the news media in this country. We have heard examples where others around the world have cited the example of President Trump. How much do you think his words against the media in the United States, where there's First Amendment protection, are having influence in other places in the world?
Well, let's say this for sure. It doesn't help. I mean, the U.S. should be inspiring countries around the world with its respect for the role of independent media, instead of inspiring people with this new trope of fake news. I mean, the example we started was Myanmar, and in Myanmar, the government has called reporting on the Rohingya crisis fake news. So it's provided a very convenient new framework for repressive governments to justify their action in controlling the media. And we see new laws coming on the books criminalizing fake news. Journalists around the world, last year we had a record number of journalists in prison around the world, 262. One thing that's interesting, the number of journalists jailed around the world, while still a fraction of the total number, has more than doubled, from 9 to 21. So we're seeing this as a convenient framework, convenient justification around the world, and so that is indeed very troubling.
Joel Stein, thanks so much for joining us, Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thank you.
South Africa's drought-hit city of Cape Town is introducing new water restrictions in an attempt to avoid what it calls Day Zero, the day in mid-April when it might have to turn off most taps. At a natural spring where residents converge to fill water containers, tensions are growing. The city is now taking over management of the site because of the increasing noise and traffic congestion caused by people collecting water around the clock. With Day Zero approaching, authorities say they might have to turn off most of the city's taps if residents don't start saving more water. Up next, a love letter to Motown. You're watching Arise America.